Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Left Hand and Leftist Podcast. You all, I am so excited to be here with you all. We have an amazing episode for you all today. We're going to be talking about legislation coming up in the General Assembly of Maryland to allow more candidates from multiple parties to be able to be on the debate stage. We're going to be talking about ICE and immigration. We're going to be talking about a whole host of things with the upcoming 2026 midterm elections here in Maryland. Joining me for this wonderful conversation is Andy Ellis. He is the candidate for the Maryland Green Party governor nomination, as well as a community activist. You all, I'm so excited. But before we get into the episode, if you hear anything that you enjoy, please don't forget to rate us 5 stars, give us a like, comment, subscribe, but also hit that notifications button so you can get alerted to every time we drop a new episode. And with that, let's get the conversation started. Awesome. What's up, you all? Andy Ellis is in the house. Thank you so much for being here. How have you been?
Been great. It's been a cold winter so far. There's a lot going on in the world, but as good as I can be in a world where capitalism, white supremacy, and fascism is incumbent upon us, I think I'm doing that. So
right. I mean, we're doing as best as we can out here with all the crazy. And I'll just say this real quick before we even like get into the conversation. I always am so happy to have just other people on who are on the left, but also not inside the duopoly left too, because it's a different type of conversation you have when it's someone who's to the left, but they're in the Democratic Party, and someone who's to the left and they're outside of that, whether it's Green Party, PSL, or independent. You get actually like anti-capitalist, but also anti-establishment rhetoric that's like just unfiltered.
Yeah. And, I think we need that kind of unfiltered rhetoric right now. I think we need sharp analysis that is honest and tells the truth. I think we need a bold vision of the world that we're trying to get to. And I don't think we can wait for it. I don't think we can hope that 2026 or 2028 is going to build the new world and that we can go back to some other system. That system's not coming back. What we're doing right now is going to determine what the next 10 years look like. And we've got to be bold, we've got to be honest, and we've got to be straightforward. And we got to tell people what's really happened.
I 100% agree with that. And with that, let's go ahead and get into it. I know one of the big things that we want to discuss here is some legislation that you all have that you're working on that's actually coming up this legislative session rather recently. Do you want to tell us about this bill you all have?
Yeah. So we worked with Delegate Gary Simmons in Anne Arundel County to put in a bill that would allow for all candidates who are on the general election ballot to be on the debate stage for a Maryland Public Television debate. So what has happened in the past is that Maryland Public Television, like most public television stations, have used an arbitrary standard that leaves them with just the two-party candidates. And we, in 2022, the Green Party, the Libertarian Party, and the Working Class Party tried to petition Maryland Public Television to open up the debates to the other candidates. They refused to do so. And so this year, we are, I think, going about it the right way, which is getting a piece of legislation introduced that says that the General Assembly of Maryland and the state of Maryland believe that if taxpayer dollars are used to put on a debate on public television, that all candidates on the general election ballot should be on that debate stage.
Oh, that's huge. So let's actually take a step back for like 1 second. So what is the current process that they use? Because I understand it used to be years ago, it was the League of Women Voters who would put it on. It was kind of more of an open process. Can you explain what happened to that process to where we are now?
Yeah, so in 1992, Ross Perot gets on the debate stage. He is on the debate stage for presidential debates for 2 of them, I think. And people like him. There's a whole bunch of people who really like what this guy says. And Ross Perot is the sort of goofy billionaire from Texas who has a lot of charts and a lot of facts and a lot of data. But in 1992, he was speaking to things that were about the economic anxiety that regular folks were feeling that neither of the other 2 candidates was talking about. George Bush had created the economic anxiety, and Bill Clinton had slogans, but he didn't have real hard data and facts. And so Ross Perot, this, like I say, sort of weird businessman from Texas, is up there talking about common sense and charts and economics. And again, from a billionaire's perspective, let's be clear, right? But he was still there as an independent voice, and voters loved it. He was doing really well in the polls. And I think a lot of Republicans point to Ross Perot as having taken that election. On the left, we hear about spoilers like Ralph Nader and things like that. On the right, they think Ross Perot helped Bill Clinton win that election. Right. So after that, both parties came together and realized that we should never allow a third party into a debate for president again. Cut out the League of Women Voters, created their own sort of organization that handles this. Then in 1999, there's a Supreme Court case in Arkansas because Arkansas Public Television, the state of Arkansas is trying to compel Arkansas Public Television to allow all candidates who are in a Senate debate into the debate. That doesn't happen. There's a case called Forbes versus Arkansas Educational Television Cooperative, in which the Supreme Court rules that public broadcasters have a right to their editorial standards, and because they could refuse the money, right? If they refuse the money, they'd still have a broadcast license, and so they have a First Amendment right because they're not just an agency of the state. They are, a cooperative that gets state funding, but they could act on their own. So fast forward to Maryland in 2006, Kevin Zeese, who is a United States Senate candidate as a Green Party person, got on the debate stage in a United States Senate race. And the Washington Post basically says he wins the debate. He's in there again with facts, truth, reality. And the regular journalists and the regular candidates are like, this is not good. We can't allow this to happen. Maryland Public Television starts covering debates at some point, and they adopt editorial standards that say that you have to have 10% polling in a statewide race to get on the ballot for the general election. That's something that no third-party candidate for Senate has done in Maryland. No third-party candidate for governor has done in Maryland. Basically, that's a number that nobody's going to get to. There's some other things in there, like you can demonstrate viability via X, Y, and Z, but they're even more arbitrary than that. So 2016, Margaret Flowers is running for United States Senate against Kathy Shalega and Chris Van Hollen, and she is actively trying to get into the debates. And she sort of takes a protest, get on the stage and make them drag you off type of approach to it.
All the other candidates, you shouldn't be having a closed debate. She's a legitimate candidate who should be included. And so I hope that you'll respect her right to be here.
Not a full discussion if you don't have all viewpoints included, and I'm a ballot candidate on the ballot. So I hope you, and I appreciate you allowing me to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you. If you don't mind leaving the stage at this point, so that we can continue with this organized debate.
I'm a candidate on the ballot. I have a statewide campaign. I don't understand why I'm not here. I add a lot of the discussion.
The rules were pretty much.
There's been a very welcoming embrace of the discussion. We get a full range. I think it's important for voters to understand the differences between myself and Congressman Van Hollen and Delegate Shalega. Otherwise, they don't really know. I mean, you say you're a public university and you want to educate the public, but without having a full public discussion, that doesn't actually happen. So how does this serve democracy or serve the public if I'm excluded from this discussion when I'm on the ballot? I don't.
Ms. Flowers, you don't have to leave now.
It's Dr. Flowers, and I'm a candidate for U.S. Senate in Maryland. And this is how you're treating a candidate? This is how they're treating. This is why our democracy is a shame.
Can we open this? Can we open this podium to her? I think it'd be reasonable.
Are excluded from this. You need to know this share is going on because most of you are not aware that the policies are being put forth without a full discussion. People don't know what their choices are.
Several debates that occurred during the 2016 cycle, Margaret Flowers gets pulled off the stage by the police on television, making the argument about debate inclusion. As I said, 2022, in a race for governor that was between Wes Moore and an idiot named Dan Cox. Am I allowed to say that here?
Well, yeah, please. We are free speech here. Cussing, name calling, all that.
There's very few people I'll call names, but Dan Cox is one of the people that I like to call names because I really just think that he is everything that is wrong with the worst part of America. So anyway, he's losing. He's down by 30 points in the polls. Wes Moore is debating him. The Libertarians, the Greens, and the Working Class Party try to get on the debate stage by petitioning to Maryland Public Television. Maryland Public Television ignores them. And it's like, look, the Libertarian ended up closer to Dan Cox than Dan Cox ended up to Wes Moore, right? And so, like, that, it's not about changing competition in that case. It's not about changing outcomes. It was about a preference that Maryland Public Television had. So we get to this year, and we thought about it. We could have probably gone through the path to petition, and we have a petition up on our website for this. And we think we could get in. We think we have a credible enough and viable enough campaign that even by their existing standards, we could probably get in. But that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for a systems change that allows Maryland to be a multi-party democracy. And we think that that means that there should be a law that says that everybody who is on the general election ballot, it's hard to get on the general election ballot, everybody should be allowed on by law, not by backroom deals, not by petitions, not by organizing, but by a principle of the state that says if taxpayer dollars are funding the station, it has a debate, voters should get to hear from everybody.
Okay, that's I did not know that the history went that way. So basically, like once the duopoly saw, oh wait, like third party people and independents can actually get on the stage. Yeah, we can't have that. We cannot have a free flowing thoughts of different ideas and ideologies go. So one thing I actually do want to ask you is about the current threshold now of that 10%. Can you talk about how that is unachievable by different third parties, and also kind of key in on how you don't really see third parties added in too many polls either?
Yeah, so the first thing to understand is that for the governor's race, the best third party performance since the Civil War was about 4%, and that was in 1895 from a Prohibition Party candidate. Right. So if we look at all of the times that have happened since Democrats ended Reconstruction in 1867 and took control of Maryland government at that point, there has been no third party candidate that got better than 4%. So setting a 10% threshold for governor is double what anybody's got. And in the modern era, the best anybody has got is 1.5%. Again, as I said, that 4% was 1895. Different world, different time. So the threshold right now is set 8.5 points higher than anybody has ever gotten to. The best independent candidate in a Maryland gubernatorial race was Hyman Pressman, who ran as an independent, and I believe like 1968 or something like that. He was the sitting comptroller of the city of Baltimore, and he only got 9%. Right. So if we think that even like, say, Bill Henry decided to run as an independent, in the race, the history would say he likely wouldn't even have the kind of threshold he would need to get in the debate. It is set in a way right now that has no reflection of Maryland history and no reflection of Maryland government. And we think that, first of all, we don't think there should be a threshold. We think that if you're on the ballot, that's a hard enough threshold. There's never been more than 5 or 6 people on the ballot for a gubernatorial race because it's hard to get on the ballot, right? You got to get 10,000 signatures, or you got to do this, or you got to do that. And the State Board of Elections and the General Assembly have rules about how people get on the ballot. So it's not as if like opening up the debates on MPT would cause people to spend 2 years collecting 10,000 petition signatures, right? Like we're talking about expanding the stage for one debate by 2 or 3 people most of the time. And they don't want to do it in part because the politicians who set the rules allow them to exclude folks, and both parties benefit from not having other parties on the stage. But also those foundations, if you ever watch anything on PBS, you will hear like paid for by the Rockefeller Foundation or paid for by the Ford Foundation. Well, who else doesn't want there to be a challenge to the two-party system? Because if there was, it would challenge their unique role in it. Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, all of those philanthropic and corporate sponsors that help back up PBS. Right. So you get to this place where it is like left to their own devices, they're going to set thresholds that protect the inevitability of the two-party system because that works for their approach to the world, to money, and to power.
Okay. Okay. Wow. So I and just real quick, I do want to mention again, and I said it before. I love having just like third party people on, especially because like how you're bringing it down to the corporations, how you're bringing it down to like the moneyed interest within it is just extraordinary, because we just do not hear this from other people who talk about corruption and things from a duopoly standpoint. But even with that, so with this legislation, how are you all looking to actually change the system from what it currently is? What are you actually hearing from different lawmakers? Because it seems like this is a hard task to actually do when you consider the majority of the General Assembly is Democrats.
When we started this, when we started thinking about this idea, it was before there was a whole lot of conflict between the General Assembly and the governor. And I think in a world where it was O'Malley as governor and it was O'Malley as governor or even Hogan as governor, and the General Assembly was sort of unified uh, around how they related to the governor, this would have been much less likely. But I think when you look at a world where Wes Moore is trying to run roughshod over the General Assembly, trying to deny the will of the Black Caucus, trying to to veto a lot of bills that were important to people so that he can bolster his national image and bolster his prominence with, Ezra Klein and the abundance folks, and so that he can raise money from billionaires. I think we're in a climate where the General Assembly is more open to a broader discussion about this. So what the bill would do is very simple. It would say MPT does not have editorial control of who is on the debate stage. Who is on the debate stage is determined by who is on the ballot. So if there's a Green, a Libertarian, a working class party, a Democrat, and a Republican on the ballot for the general election for governor, all 5 of those people would receive an invite to the debate. It does not affect primaries. It does not affect down ballot races. It does not. And if somebody dropped out, Thiru Virajna dropped out of the race at the last minute a couple of years ago, he wouldn't be included in the debate. But anybody who's running on the ballot included in a statewide race would be included in any debate. Now, MPT would have the power to refuse. They could say, no, we are not going to do what we've done every year in the past and host a debate because we do not believe in expanding beyond the two-party system. That would be their right under this bill. That would be a pretty drastic move on their part that would probably require us to rethink whether they get to make that decision or not. But that's pretty much the simple thing that it does. It takes away editorial control of who is on the debate stage and leaves the editorial control of what the questions are, what the topics are, who the moderators are, what the length is, how many of them, what the format is, all that stuff. All that stuff should be editorial control of the media company, but not who is on the stage.
Wow. So this would only be controlling the candidates who are able to debate. You don't have to worry about people saying, oh, so the state is going to control what questions get answered
Nope.
or all that. Wow. Okay. So playing devil's advocate here, some people could look and say, well, there's never been a third party person win the governorship. As you said before, the best independent candidate only got 9% in polling. So some people here would say, what's the point of having a third party person on the stage when you know it's either going to be a Democrat or Republican win?
I mean, frankly, I think most of the time, unless Larry Hogan is running, that it's going to be a Democrat. And in 2022, Wes Moore beat Dan Cox by 35 points. So there was not, Dan Cox shouldn't have been on the stage if it was about who could win in 2022. Right. And I think that's going to be the case this year. This week, Larry Hogan dropped out of the race and said that he was no longer interested in running. The rest of the Republican field, 2 of them raised less money than we did, right? We feel good about what we raised, but major party candidates for governor of the state of Maryland raising less than a third party campaign. And we have more cash on hand. We have more cash on hand than John Myrick or Ed Hale. I think we raised $17,000 in 2025, which is pretty good for a third party campaign, but terrible for a Republican campaign to be below that threshold, right?
Yeah. Especially when they take corporate money and PACs and all that.
Right. Terrible. Right. So the first thing is, just like when we talk about redistricting, it's not like the maps were fair yesterday. Right. And so the debate is not there for competitive candidates right now, because most statewide races in Maryland are not competitive. They're blowouts. They're at least double digits in almost every case. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, we do not believe that the sole purpose of running a race is in order to win it. We think that running a race can cause political realignments. We think that it can expose the way that the two parties lie. We can expose the way that they rely on billionaires, that they both serve billionaires, that the game is rigged. We think that it can bring in people who have left politics. We think that it can introduce new ideas that are often represented by some of the people in the General Assembly, but not given voice because the candidate Wes Moore, who is a centrist, billionaire-loving, corporate subsidizing, austerity abundance Democrat, is not representative of a lot of the people who are in the General Assembly in his party. And we think we can give voice to those folks. We think a lot of our proposals are things that people on the left edge of the Democratic Party support, and we think they need to be on the debate stage. If you think about it, like an issue like funding public television, for example, right? Imagine that MPT had a question in the debate, which was, how would you fund public television? If it was just two candidates, John Myrick would get up there and he would say, we should not be subsidizing public television at a time when the budget is so strapped. Wes Moore would say, Trump took away all the money for public television, and I made sure that Maryland kept its amount of commitment that it had the previous year. Not that I closed the gap, but that I made sure that it had the previous amount. And we would get up there and we would say, we would double the public television budget the first year and then quadruple it the second year, right? If you have that debate that just has the two of them in it, Wes Moore's position looks very credible, looks compassionate, looks nice. If you have us up there, it's showing that he is actually representing the status quo and is actually an austerity version of the story because he's leaving them with less money than they had the year before. And so having a third perspective in the debate like that, or a fourth or a fifth, changes the way the debate goes down. It changes the physics of how questions interact with each other. And in some ways, it makes Wes Moore look more like a moderate too, right? I mean, that's the other thing, because if John Myrick and Wes Moore, or Ed Hale and Wes Moore are the only people on the stage, they can paint him as a radical socialist. But if we are talking about how he is making deals on behalf of the data center lobby, how he's hanging out with billionaires, how he's giving more money to the police, how he's cutting funds for disabilities, he looks like a moderate centrist, and they don't get to lie and say he's a radical socialist when we're up there being like, hey, radical socialist here, So it changes the dynamics, it changes what people hear, it changes who listens, and it changes the way the questions interact outside of a binary, but into a more complex political frame.
No, I love that because one of the things that I heard on your podcast mentioned before is that if you just have the Republican and Democrats on, you were talking about reparations and how the Republicans will just stand up and say reparations was horrible. We should never pass the legislation. Wes Moore will say, yes, that's why I vetoed it because it was bad legislation. And then there's no one actually up on the stage fighting for reparations or actually even making the case for it. And you're right, it does put Wes Moore to look like this major, I dare to even say leftist progressive person when you're right. He is a center, you could say a center right elected official.
I mean, I was on Kim Klasik's show last year. Kim Klasik, conservative talk radio host here in Baltimore. And what she said is she thinks Wes is more of a Republican than people understand. Right? And I was like, okay.
Kim, like Republican Kim
Klasik was like, gets Wes Moore. She's like, he uses the language of progressives in order to get those folks to vote for him. But he really governs like a conservative in a lot of ways. And in a lot of ways, he doesn't govern that different than Larry Hogan governed, right? Pro-corporate, pro-business, pro-industry, anti-regulation, move fast with executive orders, right? And more investment in law enforcement than Larry Hogan ever made, right? But the thing is that Larry Hogan didn't go to Hopkins and he didn't go to Oxford, and he doesn't have the elite connections that Wes Moore has cultivated. Wes Moore spends his summer at Billionaires Summer Camp in Utah, hobnobbing with all the tech executives and the finance executives and the big law executives and things like that. And if you look at who's in his cabinet, it's big law, big lobbying, big environmentalism, or big finance, and the gas industry. Wes Moore is a better billionaire coddling candidate than Larry Hogan ever could be. I think that part of the reason that Larry Hogan dropped out, first of all, I think he dropped out because he ran on a ticket with Trump and everybody in Maryland realized he wasn't any different. But second, I think he realized he dropped out because he didn't have any way to run against Wes Moore. Wes Moore and Larry Hogan are very similar on a lot of policies, except Wes Moore has the good rhetoric. And like Wes Moore is 30 years younger and like more fun and more exciting and more charismatic. I mean, it would have been very bad for Larry Hogan. And I think he knew that, which is why he dropped out.
Yeah, same talking points, different messenger at that point. And actually, to that, I do want to ask you because I've had different people on and different conversations with people. The one common theme is that the General Assembly actually is seen now as less progressive than they used to be when you had Larry Hogan as governor, because then you had the Democrats wanting to actually make a difference by saying, this is who we are, this is who Larry Hogan is, watch him veto all of these things. But we see now in the General Assembly, yes, they will override vetoes, but there's also a level of like we need to like moderate our own legislation just to appease the governor because he is a fellow Democrat.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's really good political science rhetoric or research that says that when Democrats have supermajorities in state legislatures and they have Democratic governors, they are more conservative, they are more slow, and they're more focused on protecting the governor and protecting the supermajority than they are focused on doing big, fast, transformative things that will pay off for their bases. Right. And it makes sense, right? Like Maryland is a perfect example of this. The supermajority is so strong that they end up that if you are on the left side of the Democratic caucus, you're basically irrelevant in anything that matters. And anything that like is a real political power play, you don't have any power because you could sit out, Gabe Acevero could sit out any vote he wanted, and the thing would still pass, right? And so power for the left comes from the ability to stop the center from getting everything they want. And the left does not have that power in the Maryland General Assembly. Like, I think the people in the General Assembly are more progressive than they've ever been. And the policies that are coming out of the General Assembly are more moderate than they've ever been in a lot of ways. And well, now we'll see what happens this year. I mean, I think having Pena Melnick in the House, and I think the conflict between Moore and Ferguson could change some of that stuff. And I mean, it's complicated because Ferguson has, State Senate President Bill Ferguson has a primary challenger that Wes might use some of that $250,000 that he set aside into his Slate account to help if Ferguson slows him down on this redistricting thing. And that guy is running against Ferguson on a progressive platform. So we could see a year where both Pena Melnick and Ferguson are pushing more progressive policy and daring the governor to veto it this year. Because if he vetoes it this year, they get no overrides.
Whoa.
Right? Because the session ends, right? It's a new General Assembly when they come back in 2027. So in the last year of a governor's term, there's no overrides on vetoes. So we're watching for some of these ICE bills that are coming through and things like that to get vetoed by the governor this year because he knows there won't be an override on them and he knows that will work well for him in front of a national audience. It'll depend on what the polls say that given day and what his
Of course.
fundraisers tell him on that given day. But I would not be surprised if some of these bills that people are excited about right now get vetoed by Wes Moore in May because there's no consequence for him doing it unless we're strong enough in order to hold him accountable for that.
You're right. You're right. And with that, I do want to transition to talk about ICE because one of the biggest bills for this is the ban 287G. And I do first want to get your perspective on that legislation, but also what do you think about the sudden change in Senate President Bill Ferguson actually say like, yes, this is a bill that we want to pass in a clean version of the bill?
This is a bill that was too little too late last year, and he killed it in a literal backroom deal at the last moment. Right? Because the polls told him that he needed to be scared of taking that position. And so, yes, it's fine. Yes, ban the 287G agreements, obviously. Right? But this should not be a thing that we have to fight over multiple sessions for. This should not be in a state that is as blue as Maryland and as black and brown as Maryland. This should not be a place where we have to fight over multiple sessions in order to ban MAGA sheriffs from picking people up so they can turn them over to ICE. Like, it is ridiculous that we have to talk about this again. This is too little too late this year, and fighting this battle this year fails to understand the degree to which ICE has transformed into a stormtrooper army that is rampaging through our cities and is probably coming to Baltimore and PG County pretty soon. right? And so it is like, because of his political maneuvering last year, instead of fighting the real battles we need to fight this year, which are how we give our law enforcement the ability to protect our citizens and our residents from ICE, how we prosecute ICE agents who are breaking the law, how we stop ICE from operating, and not just in prisons and in jails and courthouses, but in schools and communities, on street corners, and in people's houses, right? 287G agreement, banning 287G agreements isn't going to do anything when ICE says we're going to kick down your door if we want to, because we can, because we're ICE, right? And so, yes, obviously we should ban the 287G agreements. We should ban all cooperation with ICE. We should prosecute any ICE agents who are breaking the law. And we should give our local jurisdictions and local law enforcement the power to stand up in between ICE and our residents and make sure that they're protecting them, right? And so we put out a statement earlier this week that said that we need to abolish ICE, and that at the federal level, we need to abolish ICE and create a pathway to citizenship. We need to pass state laws that use the full power of our state to stand up against Trump and his Gestapo ICE forces, right? And we need to make sure that we're giving law enforcement what they need. And I think, if you look at that statement, I think it says what a lot of Democrats believe. I think a lot of Democrats believe everything we said in that statement, and they have become trained to take crumbs like 287G agreements, or what is the bill that is like
No masking.
the masking one? Okay, whatever. Like, fine, right? But it is like, okay, they don't actually care, right? Like, they don't care once they've been given the ability to kick down your door and take your children, whether they have a mask on, because JD Vance reminded us that they have absolute immunity, right? So they probably would like the mask, but that's not going to stop them. The other one that is, don't hire anyone in Maryland law enforcement that got hired by Trump, is the most Democrat brained idiocy I've ever heard, because it's not as if people who work for ICE who are throwing tear gas grenades into families' cars, who got hired under Obama or hired under Biden, should be working law enforcement here in Maryland, right? And it is like, okay, why are you specifying that these people are like not allowed to work if they're hired under Trump? And so it's too little because it only focuses on people who are hired under Trump, and it's too much because it's like, we can't say nobody who worked for this federal agency can work in Maryland law enforcement. That's like, we can, but it's going to get struck down right away. It's entirely performative. And what I think we should say is strict record scrutiny on anybody who is involved in anything illegal when they work for ICE, prosecute as many of the people as we can who are involved, and use that as the means to keep them from being involved in law enforcement, right? But the idea that it should only be confined to people who are hired under Trump sanitizes what was happening with ICE before that, and doesn't account for the fact that these people kept working there after the agency changed, right? Like, those people, the idea that somebody hired under Biden who is kicking down doors right now, dragging kids out, would be able to work in PG County law enforcement or something like that, but somebody who was hired under Trump would not, is just stupid.
Yeah. And then on top of that, the people who went in under Trump are being trained by the people who've been there longer than that. So
Right.
you have just the same. It's like with the police now, you can't just say, oh, all the police that were just hired under Hogan are bad. No, it's the police that came before that. It's the police, it's the system itself. And kind of one thing, can you explain further is when you say give law enforcement the tools that they need, I see this as hopefully the move to abolish ICE is a bigger push as well to abolish police and create a new system of public safety, because as we've seen, what people are going through with ICE is the same thing that Black people have been going through with police for centuries, since the founding of this country.
Totally. And so when I say we understand, we have a very clear understanding that when we say give law enforcement the ability to protect people from ICE, they're not going to do that, right? But we think they should. We think in a society that worked properly, where we had police and we had law enforcement, those police would stand there between our neighbors and the federal enforcement, right? If the federal law enforcement was breaking the law. So we make that as somewhat of an impossible demand, recognizing the reality of policing as it exists right now. But we should. I mean, we need Those are the people who we have given the authority to have guns so they can defend our residents from illegal things in our state, right? Whatever we feel about that institution in a society that functioned properly, that would be who would protect us from federal employees that are acting illegally, right? So I just want to be clear that we recognize that that call is not is an impossible demand to illustrate the way that law enforcement is broken and the way that it would function in a good society, right?
Okay.
So the second thing I will say is, like, when I think about something like abolition of police, which I think is different than abolition of ICE, right? ICE only started existing in 2003. Police are an abstract concept that have existed for us for much longer. And yes, of course, abolition of policing, abolition of prisons, abolition of coercive mechanisms and state violence are always the end goal, are always the future focus. The question is, what do we do in the meantime? Because we can't abolish them today. Even if I was the governor and I said abolish the police, that would last as long as it took for the police to come and to the
Arrest you.
governor's office and shoot me, right? Like, or arrest me at best, right? So we have to think about what we can do in the meantime in order to put policing under much more community control, much more community oversight, and, to really think back to what the Panthers meant when they said community control of the police, right? Like, they were recognizing that, yes, in the future state, after the revolution, they're going to all be gone. But what we need in the meantime is democratic institutions at the local level that can stop the police from having impunity to do whatever they want to the community, that have them work in service with the community and have them be accountable to the community, not to their own internal review boards. So I think we need to constantly push to increase the amount of control regular folks have over the police in their community and not rely on the state government to do it, not rely on the federal government to do it, not rely on any of those folks who, for the most part, have given up on anything other than more law enforcement. Wes Moore, 2 days after Renee Good was shot, said that he was announcing a record commitment to funding more law enforcement in Maryland. He's running on more law enforcement. He's running on deals on supercharging the data center industry, and he's running on not taxing the wealthy and the corporations and passing the fees on to regular Marylanders, and so we've got to stop that. We've got to stop that increased funding for law enforcement. We've got to build community control mechanisms, and then we've got to work toward the future in which there are no police necessary, in which there are no prisons allowed.
Definitely love that. So actually, turning to some of the stuff you just mentioned, and one thing I have been kind of shocked about is all the talk about the $1.5 billion budget deficit that we have within the state of Maryland. And you, like you said, Westmore has announced we are not raising taxes on people. You heard social media and on the ground as like, okay, great, he's not going to raise my taxes. The one thing that I've been seeing certain sections of the left talk about is it's not about regular working class people's taxes. It's not putting in a wealth tax, not putting in a billionaire's tax that we see like in California, Gavin Newsom shot down. Can you speak to the Green Party's thought when taxing the wealthy, and also how would you handle the budget deficit?
Sure. So in 2021, when the Maryland future, the decade-long investment in education was passed, the budget office in Annapolis told the General Assembly that it would require them to raise property taxes, sales taxes, and income taxes. At the time, the Maryland Center for Economic Policy put forward what was the beginning of what became the Fair Share Act, which was about taxing the wealthy, closing corporate tax loopholes, closing the LLC loophole, and then giving money back to working and poor Marylanders. At the time, Bill Ferguson refused the ability, said, we are not going to raise any of those taxes. We're going to get revenue in other ways. What revenue in other ways meant was legalizing cannabis, legalizing sports betting, passing all sorts of fees onto regular folk, increasing fees on regular folks, driver's registration, all this stuff that we hear the right complain about, but they're right to complain about. Right. And passing money on to counties. And Moore's current budget, the way that he solves much of the problem without raising taxes, is passing more money on to counties and raiding funds for other things that are strategic funds and things like that. if Moore ran on, you can find glimpses of it in 2022, where he says we need to tax wealthy people like me more. We need to have more progressive taxes. If in his first term, when he had the mandate to raise taxes because he had just been elected on it, he had done so, that would have, he had done what he did last year. Last year, he created 2 new brackets for higher income earners, and he raised taxes a little bit on people who make over $500,000 a year. If he had done that in 2022 or 2023 instead of 2025, we would have had the revenue from that for 2 years as we got into the time when Trump started cutting federal money and things like that. That means that the cuts that Moore has proposed to disability services probably wouldn't have to be made. That means a lot of other things probably wouldn't have had to be made. He stalled on it in 2023 because he knew the Senate race was coming up in 2024, and he was worried about Larry Hogan entering the Senate race. He stalled on it in 2024 because he was worried about Larry Hogan entering the Senate race. So he waited for the tax increase until 2025 last year. All the while, they were stacking these fees up on regular folks, weren't taxing the corporations. They were giving out corporate tax breaks left and right in order to try to lure people to come here. So now we get to this place where they sort of say, but for Trump, we would be fine. No, but for Trump, we wouldn't be fine. And Trump makes it way worse, right? So it's like, the right will say Trump has nothing to do with it. It's all Wes Moore. And the left will say it's all Larry Hogan and Donald Trump. None of those things are true. Larry Hogan, Wes Moore, Donald Trump, and the Democrats in the General Assembly all made it so that we got to the place that we are right now, because they're afraid to tax the wealthy. They're afraid to close the corporate tax loopholes. They're afraid to stop giving tax giveaways to big corporations, and they're afraid to stop making everything fees on regular people for everything. So what would we do? We would vastly increase the amount of tax that people who make over $1 million have to pay. That's a lot of money. Those folks should pay more. If you're a billionaire, you pay even more. We would close the LLC loopholes that would allow LLCs in order to evade taxes for the wealthiest people. We would open up a public bank that allowed us to have our money here in Maryland for infrastructure investment and things like that, so we weren't paying Wall Street interest. We would expand the number of cooperatives that are able to expand in Maryland so that people can start small businesses that are owned by residents. We would also figure out how to claw back money from institutions like Johns Hopkins that have huge endowments that were built on the back of enslaved people and on the back of experiments on Black people and on the backs of predatory relationships with their community. I think there's a lot of things we can do to get revenue in the state of Maryland that are not making driver's registration cost $200, are making these other things happen, that are focused on taxing the wealthy in order to get them to pay what they need, taxing the corporations in order to get them to pay what they need, and supporting local businesses growing here in a way that builds a new kind of economy for the future that we deserve, not the one that Larry Hogan wants us to go back to and Wes Moore wants us to go back to. So they could have solved this problem. This is a problem of their own making. The refusal this year to increase taxes means austerity politics are coming again. That will make Ezra Klein and all those folks happy because they like austerity politics and Wes Moore is their darling. And so that will make him happy. And we just need to understand that the federal money is not coming back like it ever was. And we're going to have to ask wealthy Marylanders and the corporations that do business here to pay more money.
No, you're exactly right. And even if let's say in 2028 we have a Democrat back in the White House, we're still not going to see all of these federal jobs come back, because I highly doubt Democrats are going to come back and say, all right, we're going to reopen the federal government, hire a whole bunch of people back. They're going to kind of keep it at where it is now and just move forward from there. But then also, you're exactly right. And I'm so glad that you pointed out the registration fees. It is insane that to get my car registered for like 1 or 2 years, I'm paying $200 something. When I talk to my friends who live in Florida or New Jersey, they talk about, oh, I just pay like $35, $50 and I'm good for a couple years. It's insane how in Maryland we look at the most regressive ways to fund our government rather than actually taking it from the ones who have the most amount of money. And we see this even in data centers, which goes my next question towards you, is that a lot of people are fighting not just their West Moore and the state government, but also local governments saying that we do not want data centers in our communities, which one I totally agree with. But another thing that I've noticed that a lot of counties are doing and people aren't talking about as much is that data centers are actually able to get tax benefits for their quote unquote property, so such as like changing out servers and different technology as well. And can you speak to kind of your view on data centers, but also your view on how Maryland and Westmore is currently handling the data center problem?
Yeah, so let's start in 2020. 2020, Larry Hogan passes tax breaks, passes decade-long tax breaks for property and some of the things that you're talking about for data center development. But regulations have not caught up to that yet. So in 2023, you have this project that is coming in Frederick, which was going to be this big data center project in Frederick, and it was going to use like 150 diesel generators or something like that. Public Service Commission rightly shuts down that project in 2023. And that corporation pulls out of its desire to build a data center in Frederick. Public Service Commission shuts it down because they're like, we're not sure how we feel about having these diesel generators, and you should explain how you're going to use energy, and you're going to explain the environmental impact and the noise impact and those type of things. Reasonable regulations, right? Like things we would expect a regulatory state like Maryland to apply, they did. And this caused this business to leave. Wes Morris says he's very disappointed about it. 2024 comes out one of the administration priorities, which is sort of, I think, the Critical Infrastructure Act. The Critical Infrastructure Act exempts a lot of the infrastructure from data centers from PSC review. And Wes Moore at the signing ceremony for it says this will supercharge the data center industry in our state in 2024. It was a response to the company in Frederick pulling out. It was a bill designed to clear the regulatory hurdles for new data centers so that we could compete with Virginia and Pennsylvania. And like I said, at the signing ceremony, Westmore says this will supercharge the data center industry in our state. So that is the groundwork for where we are right now. The bill that came out last year that said that we need to study data centers then gets vetoed by Westmore. He says we don't need to study. This year, he and Governor Shapiro, Governor Youngkin, and Governor Murphy go to the PJM, which is the regional transmission operator that controls the energy for like 13 different states, and submit a proposal on behalf of the data center lobby that would allow data centers to bring their own energy to the site to co-locate energy production on the facility of a data center. Now, what this means in practice is fracked gas plants and nuclear plants would be built on the property of data centers. This is happening in Western Pennsylvania. This is happening in Ohio. And Wes Moore, as chair of the National Governors Association, is calling for or as vice chair of the National Governors Association, is calling for deregulation of this type of co-location. And this is where he uses his phrase, we need to move from the party of no and slow to the party of yes and now. The context he's using that in is fast tracking natural gas plants co-located on data center properties. And so what that sets up is a situation where Moore is working directly for the data center lobby in order to make Maryland just like Virginia and Pennsylvania, right? Directly for the data center lobby, right? Like, I think I want to just say that one more time. They submitted this to PJM on behalf of the data center lobby. And so there's a Republican bill sponsored by like Kathy Shalega, Matt Morgan, Mark Fisher, like the Freedom Caucus bill.
Wow. Yeah.
Freedom Caucus bill puts a moratorium on data centers unless there is co-location of gas or nuclear plants with those data centers.
You had me up here for a second and then it just took it right back down.
Right. So, I mean, this is a good example of how the opposition party in Annapolis is not an actual opposition party. If we had a real opposition party, what we would say is ban hyperscale data centers in Maryland right now, just like we banned fracking. We know it is a toxic industry. We know it is hazardous. And we know that these big, huge data centers that require 50 diesel generators or their own fracked gas or nuclear plant are not productive or helpful for Maryland. But that doesn't mean that we can't have data centers, right? We can have small, renewably powered data centers that are working at community scale. They could even be municipal data centers that were part of helping startups in that community to have access to some data infrastructure without having to pay the private equity backed big tech giant data center for some access on their servers. So if we think there's only a couple of companies that can build these hyperscale data centers that are trying to get built everywhere, and those are the ones that are bad. We should not have Amazon or Palantir or AWS or whoever or Google or any of those folks building those facilities here in Maryland. We should ban that, and we should figure out how we can be the place where we lead in small scale, renewable, environmentally conscious data centers that work in conjunction with community to help us build a new ecosystem of local Maryland run businesses that might be tech businesses, right? Like I spent 15 years in the tech industry. I'm not anti tech. I'm starting a business that helps people to implement AI tools in line with their values. Like I'm not anti AI, but I am anti hyperscale data centers. They're a terrible piece of investment. They sustain the accumulation of wealth of the worst companies, and they are financed in a Ponzi scheme by private equity. And the more of them that we have here, the more hulking remnants of them that we're going to have here when that bubble bursts and those companies go under. And our Charles County or Baltimore City or Prince George's County have this huge environmentally toxic place that now has to be remediated with no business able to remediate it. So the simple answer to the question is ban hyperscale data centers right now. Ban them. Figure out how to become the leader in community scale renewably powered data centers, and don't allow co-location of any nuclear plant or fracked gas plant next to any business, much less a data center.
Yeah, that's that part is the most insane thing I've heard, because right now Charles County is looking at passing a zoning text amendment to allow the permitting of data centers, and they're putting them near like residential homes and things. So could you imagine residential homes, a data center, and then a nuclear power plant just right there for whatever Chernobyl we may have one day? But also, a lot of people are having issues with data centers too, because it's giving remnants of the dot-com bubble and the housing crash of that. Hey, we're going to build up all these data centers, and then 5-10 years from now, oh, we don't need data centers as we used to. So now you just have these big empty buildings that take up a lot of room. And also, one other thing I haven't heard many people talk about as much too is that when it comes that the servers for data centers only last like 3 to 5 years. So you're talking about consistent output of lead and other chemicals into our landfills, which we already have overflowing landfills within the state of Maryland.
Right, right. So one thing that I think is really important is when the entire conversation around data centers comes down to how they affect our energy bills, the logical conclusion is that they should have their own power sources. I understand how people get there. They look at the problem because they're politicians, and energy bills are relevant to most of their residents, regardless of where they live. But if you live in Landover, or you live in Charles County, or you live in any one of those places where they're trying to build them in black and brown and poor communities, right? Like the energy bill is not the only thing you care about. And so out of sight, out of mind, energy bills become what politicians focus on. And as long as we only focus on energy bills, Republicans and Democrats agree the solution to that is co-locating power generation off the grid on the facility of the data center. That's even worse environmental racism, right? Because now not only do you have a data center in your community, but you have a fracked gas plant in your community, or you have 50 diesel generators in your community, right? And so that solution is even worse environmental racism than the current thing is. So we have to look at them holistically and how they impact people. We have to understand from an environmental justice and a racial justice perspective how where they're getting sited, continuation of decades of industrial siting in black and brown communities, right? And we also have to understand that this pollution point that you're making is really important, because they are lasting damage and pollution that is going to exist in a lot of places. Now, people will say, can't we build them with solar energy? And this is where the hyperscale piece comes in. We can build a small community scale data center that has some servers in it with renewables. We can do that. right? Like if Charles County wanted to start a program that said, we're going to help people in Charles County start tech businesses by providing them some server space in a renewably powered data center that is municipally run. And, we have standards on it and there's democratic accountability for it. Great. Let's do that. Let's do that. So folks aren't having to give money to Amazon or Google or Oracle or Palantir in order to have the data infrastructure for their tech startup that they want to engage in, right? But the hyperscale is only there for the trillion-dollar companies. Hyperscale data centers are only there for the trillion-dollar companies and the companies that want to be trillion-dollar companies. And that is where we need to make these distinctions, that a place that has servers, not bad, right? Like lots of places have servers. I mean, for some folks it's bad. Some folks are like, no servers, Luddite, primitivism, all that stuff. Fine, I respect that position. But if we accept that there's going to be technology, we need to structure it in a way that is human scale and supports communities and supports the people that we want it to, not make giveaways to trillion-dollar corporations because we think that they might give us campaign donations down the road.
Okay. I love it. I love it. And then on two last topics before I let you go here. One is on recently on a podcast I had two librarians who work for public libraries in Baltimore County and Charles County, and they're talking about the huge kind of retaliation that not only they are facing, but library workers across the state are facing when it comes to being able to unionize, getting living wages, and actually not getting discriminated by actual managers and directors of library systems as well. And I'll even highlight in Charles County, you have the library board of trustees actually signed off on the most recent budget to allow the library system to use $250,000 to hire union busting law firm to do negotiations. And that is also a kind of a backdrop on what's happening at the state level with AFSCME actually getting denied their wage increase that they should have gotten. So can you talk about what is the Green Party's view on just overall unions within the state, and also what would you do to some of the problems that have been happening for workers across the state as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first thing I would say is that we support the right to strike for all public. We support the right to collectively bargain and the right to strike for all public sector employees. We think that collective bargaining and the right to strike are core tenets of any labor policy that is actually meant to empower workers and not one that is meant to empower bosses and governing boards. Right. So out of the gate, we would make it so that there was not a need for each unit, Baltimore County or Charles County or the community colleges or the graduate assistants, each to come and beg for the ability to collectively bargain. We would say blanket collective bargaining for all state employees now, right? And we would put that legislation in. We would ask that legislation be put in the first year. The second thing is we support the effort for there to be a right to strike. We think that should apply to all public sector employees. And we think that if public sector employees are allowed to collectively if they're not allowed to collectively bargain, they get exploited and are subject to what's happening to them right now. If they're allowed to bargain and they're not allowed to strike, then they don't have the power of they don't really have the power of collective bargaining. They just have the power of collective negotiation, about benefits and that type of thing.
It looks
So
nice.
I mean, it's important, right? But it's like it's for real empowerment of labor, there has to be both, right? So that's the first thing, is all public sector workers have that. The third thing I would say is we would make sure that the state standards on how AI, automation, outsourcing, and pay are meeting the needs of the people who are doing the work. They're not displacing them. I think there's going to be a lot of rush by Moore and other folks to use the framing of austerity in order to automate some of these jobs, to outsource some of these jobs, and to subcontract some of these jobs. We would put an immediate end to that practice. If you're in a union bargaining unit, you would have the ability for the union to decide whether contracting occurred, whether outsourcing occurred, whether AI occurred, and things like that. And it may be that a union agrees. It may be that a union looks at the fiscal situation and understands some jobs need to be contracted, but that is the bargaining power of workers. That should not be something that is imposed upon them from the outside. Right. So
Awesome.
now, as it comes to libraries specifically, we would double the library budget. And we would double the library budget by taking the first place we would take it from, or one of the places we would take it from, is we would end the state subsidy for horse racing. There is currently about $100 million in state money in any given year and that comes from casinos that goes to subsidize the cruel and failing horse racing industry. The Library System of Maryland last year had about $100 million budget. And so we would simply say, take the money from horse racing, give it to the libraries, double the budget, allow expansion of libraries. Libraries have a lot of power in communities to do creative programming. They're a public space for civic engagement. And this is part of our broader civic engagement platform, which calls for universal debate education in Maryland public schools, calls for expanded library budgets, calls for expanded budget for Maryland Public Television, calls for participatory budgeting, and calls for working with the universities in order to create ways that people can get engaged in self-governance. So we think libraries are part of that. Libraries are a vital part of that, and their workers need to have the protections of a union and the ability to strike in order to negotiate as fairly as they can and as powerfully as they can. And we will be pushing all of that stuff. And one of the things that, again, going back to how we started this, all of these topics that we've talked about here today are perspectives that the voters of Maryland will not hear if the debate only includes Wes Moore and John Myrick. But if we open the debate to allow us to be on the stage, the Libertarians and the Working Class Party to be on the stage, all the stuff we're talking about today can be on public television and have a big audience of everybody who would watch that. And we think a lot of Marylanders would really support that if they had access to those ideas.
You're right. You're right. And then also with that, you would see a growing of just the amount of people who are involved in politics too. Because a lot of people check out when it is just the Republican Democrat, and you feel like they have the same message. So why would I be involved? But hearing these different messages, hearing a pro worker, pro union, anti corporate, anti capitalist person in parties such as yourself with the Green Party is something a lot of people need to hear, because a lot of people aren't even exposed to these types of talking points as well. And one last thing I do want to say, and this is going to be a big devil advocate moment for me, is that there is a lot of criticism that the Green Party gets when it comes to running for these big offices. Actually, one of my family members, shout out to Amber, is really like has a really I don't want to say bone to pick, but has a real issue when it comes to like people like Jill Stein, who we've seen continuously run for president. And a lot of her criticism goes to saying you see her pop up every 4 years, run for president, and nothing else past that. And people have that same criticism with the Green Party, is that you all target these top level state races, but people do not see as much effort put into like your local city council races, school board, and things like that. Do you have any response for what people are saying?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, I understand where the criticism is coming from, right? It feels like people only see the Green Party in presidential elections. And when they do, it feels like they're only attacking Democrats. And I understand that criticism. A couple things I will say about it to sort of clarify like why that occurs. So 30 plus states require top of the ticket races in order to allow ballot access for down ballot races. So if we get 1% in the governor's race in Maryland in 2026, that means that in 2028, Baltimore City Council candidates are able to run as Green Party candidates, right? And a lot of states have that. That is a thing that Democrats and Republicans have legislated across the country that has forced the Green Party and the Libertarian Party to run presidential candidates every 4 years. And the easiest way to stop Green Party and Libertarian and third parties that are national parties that have states that have ballot lines from running these presidential races would be to have Democrats and Republicans change ballot access requirements so that they didn't require top of the ticket races in order to be able to run down ballot races. That would change the dynamics within the Green Party about how we have this debate. So right now, anytime we have this debate within the Green Party, and it does happen within the Green Party, it's a debate that's been happening in the Green Party since 2000. People looked at the Ralph Nader race and looked at the effect that it had on the movement and things like that. And it has been a constant question. But the thing that stops us from being able to, those of us who make this argument, and I'm one of them, that we're too focused on presidential races, that stops us from being able to succeed is the structural conditions put in place by Democrats and Republicans that incentivize and require us to run for top of the ticket races, right? So that's the first part of that. The second part is, and I don't even want to get into where Jill Stein is. People can go follow Jill Stein and Jill Stein's social media, and they can see where she is, right? So that's the last time I want to talk about Jill Stein. What I want to talk about is what we are doing here in Maryland. Owen and I have been working with the Baltimore City Green Party for the last 10 years. We've worked with city council races, school board races, ballot initiatives, state races, local races, federal races. We've also done a lot of on the ground advocacy work in order to help make real things happen here in Baltimore. And I think 2024, Owen helped push the CALL Act, which allowed immigrant students to be able to transfer from a community college to state colleges without losing credits. A really important thing. If we look at the data that says the longer a working person spends trying to pursue their degree, the less likely they are to get it, right? Real on the ground organizing that made tangible outcomes change for real people. In 2024, I was a member of the Baltimore City Charter Commission, and we saw David Smith coming with a proposal to David Smith, who runs Sinclair Broadcasting, a big right-wing broadcasting organization that is a big Trump supporter.
Owns the Baltimore Sun.
Owns the Baltimore Sun and owns media networks across the country, and is the one pushing the fear of Black youth rhetoric that dominates a lot of what happens in Annapolis and things like that, and the corruption rhetoric and all of that. So they were pushing a ballot initiative in Baltimore City called Question H. Question H would have shrunk our city council from 14 elected members to 8 elected members. It was sponsored by a former Republican candidate who had run for mayor. It was funded by David Smith. $500,000 of his own money went into this effort. We, Davon Love of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, and I, and Josh Harris, who was a former Green Party candidate, and several other folks were on the Charter Commission. We saw this coming, and we started organizing folks in order to care about this. And what we knew was that no charter amendment had failed in Baltimore City in 20 years. 50 of them had passed. All of them had passed. None had been defeated. We also knew that if we wanted to defeat one, we were going to need to get the grassroots organizations, the labor organizations, the faith organizations, the elected politicians, and the media telling the right story. So we organized for a year in order to be able to help be part of putting that coalition together. We defeated that charter amendment. We defeated Question H, first one to lose in 20 years. And we turned back the billionaire, or he's not even a billionaire. I love when we talk about David Smith because I always want to call him a billionaire. And then I'm reminded that he does not have that much money. And as far as rich people go, he's actually relatively weak and feeble. But, look, we've been doing the work. We have built a Green Party and a campaign here in Maryland that is meant to be on the ground, that is rooted in organizing, that is rooted in community, that is focused on Maryland, that is working on the things that matter here. And those come from both of our experience as activists and educators. I used to run a program for Baltimore City middle school students that helped middle school students in the 14 schools that have been deemed persistently dangerous by No Child Left Behind to have debate teams. And that was we got over 1,000 students in Baltimore City middle schools participating in that league. I coached debate at Towson University, where we had a bunch of students that were from Baltimore City. Owen is a day-to-day educator. We've both been activists and organizers for a long time, and we believe that the Green Party can be strategic leverage for those organizations that are doing work on the ground and deep blue Maryland in order to be able to tell Westmore and the Democrats that if they don't get what they want, they're going to support us and take votes away from him, right? That is the proper use of the spoiler argument. That is the proper use of the frame of we take votes away from Democrats. The question is not, do we take votes away from Democrats? The question is, why are Democrats voting for a Green instead of a Democrat, right? And if we start framing it that way as a tool that allows organizations that we're aligned with and movements that we're aligned with to amplify their power in order to get the outcomes in their communities changed, then it becomes a powerful vehicle that can connect with day-to-day on-the-ground activists. And I'll say the other thing is, I'm in Annapolis pretty much once a week this session, trying to talk to people, trying to understand what's happening with different pieces of legislation and things like that, because I believe that even though I can watch it on YouTube from home, there's value in being there talking to people about what's really happening and seeing what gets said when you're not watching just what happens on YouTube. So to sum up, I have criticisms of the way that the Green Party runs presidential campaigns too. I understand why they do, and I understand why that strategy prevails within the party. And there's a lot of debate about whether it's a good strategy or not. But our campaign is focused on giving power to local grassroots and community-led organizations that are trying to change the power structures so that they can improve outcomes for the people that are in their community. And we have been doing this since Election Day in 2022. There's no every 4 years. We started that campaign the day after Election Day in 2022 because we want to make sure people can see that the Green Party can be real, credible, on the ground, work with existing movements in order to foster a climate in which people have more power and billionaires and party bosses are the ones that are compromising, not the ones that are compromising the lives of everybody else.
That's awesome. That's a wonderful response to that. And one thing I do want to have on too in the future is actually members of the actual Green Party themselves, just to talk about a different like local races. Because one of the other things that was brought up before is that you have a lot of these nonpartisan local city council races, and wanting to see the Green Party really show up for those races as well to win some of those local seats, to kind of get people in the mind frame of like, oh, the Green Party is actually a party that can win and has actual like people on the ground who have been voted in. Do you have any response for that?
Yeah. So there have been a handful of Greens that have been elected to local nonpartisan municipal offices here in Maryland over the course of time. There's a person who's elected right now who's on the council in St. Michael's. Most of the time, these races are not the race that the party focuses on. Because if you were running to be, on the town council of Tawnytown or something like that, it doesn't really help if the Green Party brings in a bunch of people that are, talking about Gaza and talking about reparations, if the issues that matter in your town are how the snow gets removed and like what days the pools are open. Right. And so I don't say that in any way to disparage that work. I say that to say those are folks who are registered Greens connected to their community and decide that they want to run because they think they have something valuable to offer. Right. And the party is happy to support those folks. But usually what those folks say when we ask them and they're running is, how can we support you? And they're like, just be quiet and don't tell anybody. Right. Because these issues that are behind me may be good at a state level, may be good at a county level, and are good at a national level, but they may not be good at the local level. And, and I don't know that if you are running for town council in Greenbelt, you need to talk about Gaza. Maybe you do, maybe you can, but
You
it's
won't
not the
really have an
same.
effect on it. Yeah.
Right. It's not the same. And so I think those races are really important. I think we should support them. And I think we should help those folks to help us apply our platform at a municipal level. Right. Like part of this is not just we have candidates that are alternatives, but it is that we have a political vision that is alternative as well. And it is important to take that from the national level, apply it at the state level, apply it at the county level, and apply it at the municipal level. And so where folks can help us to come up with those type of things, very useful for the party to interact with that. The next level up at the county level, I think is also important and are at the city level. In Baltimore City in 2020, Franca Mueller-Paz, who was a teacher, union leader, musician, and sort of badass activist, ran a campaign where she got 35% against a sitting Democrat incumbent. And that 35% had real material consequences. It had real material consequences within that race, and that it pushed the existing city council members to make a deal with the cable company in order to make sure students who were home during COVID had access to the internet. Franca was offering it as part of her platform in a much more radical way that would have had the city do it. And what ended up getting negotiated was a deal between the city and the cable provider, Comcast, Xfinity, right? But that's still the access that still changed outcomes. It still increased the access that people had to those kind of vital service during a time when most students were at home, right? So that's one thing. The second thing it did is it helped push Robert Stokes, who was the candidate who she ran against, and who won, become the supporter of the Baltimore City Reparations Commission, because he was worried about the threat that would come from his left if he didn't do something like that. And he understood that Franca was a good challenge to him, but he still won. But he understood he was vulnerable. What she showed was that he was vulnerable and that a left movement could make real change in that district. So he helped to become one of the people who sponsored the Baltimore City Reparations Commission, got it off the ground. Now, other people did too, but he did work on it. And he did work on it because he was pushed in that direction by a local candidate from the Green Party. The third thing I would say is he lost to a much more progressive, labor-friendly candidate in the next election. And he lost because she exposed where he was weak. People look at data of elections, and if you can look at the data and understand where Franca won precincts, right? I mean, I think it's important for folks to know that Franca won a bunch of precincts in Baltimore City when she ran against Robert Stokes. This is not a throwaway race. This is like, you look at the data and you can see real support for the left in the general election in ways that don't exist otherwise, and that informed the 2024 campaign. So we always have to be doing this with a focus on changing outcomes, not just providing more choices. Because choices are nice, but choices by themselves are really neoliberal. And choices that don't change outcomes and don't make people's material lives better are very, very neoliberal and are not helpful for a radical or revolutionary movement. And so we always need to understand how we can use the power of our ballot lines in order to change the outcomes so that people's lives are better. And if we're not doing that, then we're doing this wrong. But if we're doing that, there's a possibility of opening up a new system that makes the world that we live in a decade from now better than the one that we live in today.
Wow. And with that, you all, Andy Ellis. Andy, please tell our viewers and just people listening how they can get involved with with you all's campaign, ways that they can support. Any final words for the audience?
Totally. Go to gogreen2026.com. That's our website. It has a lot of material on it about what we believe, how we run the race, and how you can get involved. There are a couple ways that we know you can get involved today. One, we would ask anybody to go to our YouTube channel, check out our live stream over there, youtube.com @gogreen2026. We've got a weekly live stream. We've got a lot of content up there. The second thing we would ask you to do is go to gogreen2026.com/debate and sign the petition for us to be on the debate stage in case the bill we're talking about doesn't work. And the third thing, especially if you're a Maryland resident, is to go to our donate page. I bet you can imagine the front of it. It's gogreen2026.com donate and become one of our donors. We are running our campaign is the first small party campaign in the state of Maryland to use public financing, or to try to use the public financing program for the gubernatorial campaign. That means that if we get 1,500 Maryland donors and they raise a collective $120,000 by July, that we would qualify for a 6 to 8 times match that would allow us to go into the general election with the kind of money that we would need to put this message in front of everybody in Maryland. So even if you only have $5 that you can donate, that still matters. That still counts. It helps us to get to that threshold where we qualify for public financing. And it helps us to hire people who have been working as volunteers and come on our team so that we can have a volunteer coordinator, and we can have a video editor, and we can have a person that helps us with field, and we can have a person that helps us with writing and things like that. We're going to need all of that stuff if we want to compete on this scale. And, the last thing I'll say is we think there's a huge opportunity here. We think that the moment the world is facing, the moment the United States is facing, and the moment that Maryland is facing demands that we do something, because the old world is not coming back. And the new world is being shaped today, right now. Everything we do is shaping the new world that is to come. And if we stand up with bravery and we stand up with boldness and we anchor our solutions and values that are about people, we are going to build the world that we deserve. But if we can't do that, and we don't do that right now, we are going to all be crushed by the fascists who are in charge, the climate crisis that is coming, and the nuclear wars that they're trying to push us into. And so the moment is now to be brave, to be bold, and to do something different, because what we've done before has led us to a point where the fascists are going to win. And if we don't change course, we're all going to die. But we believe we can build the Maryland we deserve, and a Maryland that works for people, not for profit.
Awesome. Awesome. You all, that was Andy Ellis, one of the candidates for the Green Party nomination for the governor of Maryland. You all remember this is a podcast, so please like, share, subscribe. Please do all the things that Andy just told you to do. You got your calling orders. And also, you all, I will see you next Wednesday for another full episode of the Left-Handed Leftist podcast. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.